Let there be a reassessment of the relative role of the private and the public sector. There are a number of plans which can be safely handed over to the private sector. Deendayal Upadhyay, the Jansangh ideologue, wrote in 1958 in the Two Plans, Promises, Performance and Prospects, his book. This was shortly after the launch of the second five-year plan. Sugar, textiles, soap, cement, porcelain, paper, ceramic, leather. None need to be under the purview of the public sector, he said. Let the public sector unburden itself of some of the load it has unnecessarily taken upon itself. Moreover, the civil services need not be handling all industrial affairs, he contended. The government must involve the private sector in industrial development. Over 6 decades later, in 2021, in an emphatic endorsement of the private sector and an equally emphatic denouncement of the IAS in Parliament, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said, "सब कुछ बाबू ही करेंगे। IAS बन गए मतलब वो फर्टिलाइजर का कारखाना भी चलाएगा, केमिकल का कारखाना भी चलाएगा, IAS हो गए तो वो हवाई जहाज भी चलाएगा। ये कौन सी बड़ी ताकत बनाकर रख दी है हमने। बाबुओं के हाथों में देश देकर हम क्या करने वाले हैं? हमारे बाबू भी तो इस देश के हैं, तो देश का नौजवान भी इस देश का है." Modi's statement came 2 years after his government had unprecedentedly started institutionalized lateral entry into the government to infuse it with talent from the private sector, and days after it announced a public sector enterprise policy under which sick public sector companies would be privatized. The parallels between Upadhyay and Modi's rhetoric are unmissable. The endorsement of the private sector as crucial to nation building, the disdain for the monopoly of the public sector, and the denouncement of IAS officers handling all economic affairs. On first reading, it would appear that the Modi government indeed draws its economic philosophy from Upadhyay, whose integral humanism was adopted as the official philosophy of the BJP in 1985. Since 2014, when the BJP came to power, concerted efforts have been made to elevate Upadhyay to the level of Gandhi. Deendayal Upadhyay is to the BJP what Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was to Congress. R. Balashankar, the former editor of Organizer, said. From naming schemes after him to erecting his large 72-feet statue in front of the BJP office in New Delhi, from holding nationwide celebration programs to mark his birth anniversaries, to referring to him as the guiding force for the party, Upadhyay has had an overwhelming ideological presence in the party and the government's rhetoric over the last 10 years. Yet, beyond integral humanism, little is known about what Upadhyay's economic philosophy actually was. What was the political and economic context in which he was writing? Did he support the private sector? Was he anti-capitalism, or did he represent petty capitalists? How was his brand of swadeshi different from Gandhi's? Was he writing more as an economic thinker or as a political actor? Are there any overlaps between his economic philosophy and the economic policies of the Modi government over the last 10 years? And finally, are those overlaps ideological, rhetorical, or purely coincidental? With the Modi government having completed 10 years in power and set to present its 12th budget, ThePrint examines to what extent it follows the economic philosophy of its own proclaimed ideologue. A leading politician once proposed to Upadhyay that a joint front be formed against the Congress. Humoring the politician, Upadhyay quizzed him about what the front's program would be. What would be its economic policy, he pointedly asked. The politician responded, "Do not worry about them. Whatever you like, we can adopt. We are ready to support anything from an extreme Marxist to a downright capitalist program." This, for Upadhyay, who had been with the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh since the age of 21, was the root cause of the problem being faced by the country. The political and intellectual class in India, he said, could not rise above intellectual categories like socialism and capitalism created in the West. Upadhyay, for one, was opposed to both. Capitalism and socialism were both responses to each other, and both, he said, led to human misery. To quote him, he said, "Nationalism, democracy, socialism, or equality," equality, he said, is there at the root of socialism. "These three doctrines have dominated European social and political thinking. While these are all good ideals that reflect the higher aspirations of mankind, in practice, each stands opposed to the other," he said. To begin with, he argued, there was a movement for political rights from the lens of which Man was seen as a political animal. To satisfy this political man, he was given the right to vote. But as he got the right to vote, other rights diminished. What shall I do with the state if I don't get any food? I have no use of this voting right. I want bread first, Upadhyay's political man said. In response came Karl Marx, who saw man as primarily made up of body wanting bread. But those who followed Marx, Upadhyay says, got neither bread nor voting rights. The United States capitalism was at the other end for him. There, he says, man has both bread and voting rights, but he has no peace. Now he wants a peaceful sleep, he said. Moreover, both capitalism and socialism arose in specific places and specific contexts. Neither is necessarily universal, he said. Indian people, with their distinct culture, he propounded, would need their own ism. The Soviet Union inspired planning commission has no constitutional authority, and there is no reason for the Prime Minister and other cabinet ministers to be its members, Upadhyay wrote in the two plans. The existence of the commission shows that the country still thinks like a political agitator and not a practical planner. The whole planning machinery needs an overhauling, Upadhyay, a strong critic of Nehruvian economics, said. Over half a century later, on his first Independence Day speech as Prime Minister in 2014, Modi abolished the Planning Commission. But this was not the only step that Modi would take as PM, which is at least rhetorically consonant with Upadhyay's economic worldview. Consider Upadhyay's views on the following matters. 1. Food as a birthright. He said our slogan should be that the one who earns will feed and every person will have enough to eat. The right to food is a birthright. The ability to earn is a result of education and training. In a society, even those who do not earn must have food. Upadhyay's views on the social obligation to ensure that those without work get enough to eat find a clear echo in Modi's own brand of welfarism, exemplified best through the government's free ration scheme, which has become the cornerstone of Modi's welfare politics. 2. Healthcare for all. The children and the old, Upadhyay said, the deceased and the invalids, all must be cared for in the society. In the event of an individual falling prey to any disease, society must arrange for his treatment and maintenance. Here, Upadhyay argues that only when the state can provide food, clothing, shelter, and health care for all, it can be called a rule of dharma. Otherwise, he said, it is a rule of adharma. The shadow of his idea of healthcare for all can again be seen in Modi's popular Ayushman Bharat Yojana. 3rd, Swadeshi. The concept of Swadeshi, Upadhyay said, is ridiculed as old-fashioned and reactionary. We proudly use foreign aid in everything, from thinking, management, capital, methods of production, technology, etc., to even the standards and forms of consumption. This is not the road to progress and development. The positive content of Swadeshi should be used as the cornerstone of reconstruction of our economy, he said. Writing and thinking as he was in the 1950s and 60s, the fear of losing India's newly gained sovereignty loomed large on Upadhyay. Much like Gandhi, he sought to make evident the connection between economic and political sovereignty. He also saw importing foreign machinery as self-damaging for the new nation, as it would eat into the employment opportunities for its massive workforce. Therefore, India, he said, needed Bharatiya technology, which would not just not be a competitor to the Indian workforce, but also not conflict with the political and cultural objectives of the country. Now, even as the threat to political sovereignty is no longer looming, Modi has also invoked Atmanirbharta as a tool for national and cultural pride. 4. Employment for all. The unemployed people have to be fed, which is a continuous and unending drain on resources, consumed at double the speed. Therefore, instead of the usual exhortation of every worker must get food, we must think of everyone who eats must get work as the basis of our economy, Upadhyay said. Now, in 2015, Modi famously ridiculed the UPA formulated Manrega as a vestige of the previous government's povertarianism. He said while the scheme would continue under his government, it would be a living monument to the failures of the Congress. However, within a year, the centre did a U-turn on the scheme, calling it the nation's pride, and significantly increasing funds allocated to it year after year, even after the pandemic. Fifth, fiscal conservatism. If the governments follow even the ordinary routine practices of appropriating and spending public monies and of keeping expenditures strictly within limits, at least 70 to 80 crores can be saved, Upadhyay wrote. Now, whether it was during the Vajpayee's government or the past 10 years of the Modi government, there has been a remarkable adherence to managing the fiscal deficit. But let's wait before we conclude that the Modi government indeed draws its economic philosophy from Upadhyay. There was a time in our country when urbanization was considered a big problem, Modi said in 2016 at a gathering in Pune after the launch of projects under his government's flagship Smart City mission. But I, he said, feel differently. We should not consider urbanization a problem, but consider it as an opportunity. Now, the idea of urbanization as a solution to poverty is markedly different from Upadhyay's. For Upadhyay, as historian Aditya Balasubramanian notes, urbanization leads to population explosion in cities, slums, disease, deprives rural areas of talent, and deculturizes people. Clearly, it is an entirely different economic philosophy from Modi's. While several components of Modinomics can appear to be drawn from his party and its predecessor's original ideologue, a closer look at the fine print of Upadhyay's economic worldview reveals stark differences from Modi's. While the economic discourse of the 50s and 60s when Upadhyay was writing oscillated between the two poles of American capitalism and Soviet socialism, the RSS Pracharak was greatly influenced by two Indian economists who drew their inspiration of an ideal economic model from the pre-war Japanese experience of industrialization. For Upadhyay, like the Japanese, industrialization had to be led by the private sector and not the public sector, which he prolifically wrote against. This would seem to be consistent with Modi's policy, but for the difference in the scale of private enterprise the two prefer. According to Upadhyay's economic model, it would be a decentralized private enterprise that could make India self-reliant. During World War II, he wrote, a number of small-scale industries had risen to the occasion and catered to the demand of defense and other goods that could not be imported. Yet, if they are surviving today, he wrote, it is in spite of the government's and the organized private sector's antipathy. Balasubramanian, the historian, says his economic model is one that is entirely based on small-scale, labor-intensive, decentralized industry and agriculture. For him, if growth was jobless, it was useless. Even on the question of machinery, he was not opposed to machines like Gandhi so long as they did not eat into employment. Upadhyay's economic model was thus based on the idea of Chote Udyog, Choti Punji, small industrial production, small investment. In fact, in Integral Humanism, Upadhyay also noted the connection between democracy and monopolization or crony capitalism. Capitalism, he says, is intrinsically exploitative. It leads to intense competition as well. But when a monopoly is established, even the check of competition ceases to operate. Upadhyay's is then a model quite distinct from Modi's, against whom one of the opposition's most enduring attacks is that of crony capitalism. While there are a host of policies that the Modi government has introduced to alleviate the financial woes of the MSME sector, it is this sector which has been the hardest hit in the last few years with demonetization, GST, digitalization, pandemic-induced lockdowns, etc. In fact, not only does Upadhyay support small-scale industry, he is also opposed to scaling them up. He said, normally, desire precedes the effort to produce the things desired. But now, the position is reverse. Earlier, production followed the demand. Now, demand follows the production. He was opposed to this. Calling mass, large-scale production carried out in the absence of demand a dance of destruction, he argued that it is not only adversely affecting the environment, but also it can lead to economic depression. The Great Depression, he said, occurred precisely because there was nobody to consume the abundant goods in the market, leading to shutting down of factories, bankruptcy, unemployment. With schemes like Make in India and the government's stated aim of making India a manufacturing hub, The dissonance between the BJP-led government and the party's ideologue could not be more plain. Upadhyay's economic model was based on boosting savings by leveraging India's simple traditional household culture and cutting down what he perceived to be wasteful public expenditure characteristic of Nehruvian times. This, he argued, would ensure that everyone participates in the country's economic development as a national yajna. People's participation was core to Upadhyay's economics, even in large-scale government decisions like disinvestment. Upadhyay was a votary of disinvestment. Therefore, the fact that it was a BJP-led government under Vajpayee which set up a department of disinvestment to privatize sick public sector units is no surprise. It is, in fact, a goal that the Modi government too has sought to achieve, albeit with underwhelming results. But Upadhyay's idea of disinvestment was radically different from the BJP's two prime ministers. He was of the view that the shares of state undertakings should be offered for subscription. Similarly, the surplus value of industries he thought ought to be distributed amongst workers, thereby giving them a sense of what he called direct participation in the management of the surplus or capital. Much like industry, on the issue of agriculture too, Upadhyay was a votary of small scales. Unlike and in strong opposition to the gigantism represented by Nehruvian economics of the time, Upadhyay's model of economic growth was based on large volumes of production at small scales through family farming. Here again, Upadhyay's agrarian model would be in stark contrast to the Modi government's three farm laws, which were rolled back in 2021 in the face of relentless protests by farmers. Now, let's quickly turn to the politics behind this economics. When former Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, aided by his Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, announced the liberalization reforms, the BJP was put in a bind. As noted by Vinay Sitapati in Jugalbandi, the party's conundrum was this. The trader base of L.K. Advani's party was all for the removal of restrictions on their own businesses, but they wanted to limit competition from foreign companies and capital. Politically speaking, it was this voter base that wanted both the ease of doing business and protection from competition from foreign capital, whose interests Upadhyay's economic philosophy sought to protect in the 1960s. Responding to the reforms in 1991, Vajpayee said in Parliament, "Cable TV, Star TV are coming. They have in fact come. They sell luxury articles. People will watch them in their huts. Even if the children do not have milk to drink, shampoo will be bought." But within a few years, Vajpayee came to preside over the country's second-generation economic reforms as Prime Minister. What had changed? Well, both the BJP's electoral base and India itself. At the time when Upadhyay was writing, a lot of these questions of which economic model India would adopt were not settled. Bala Subramanian, the historian, said, by the time even Vajpayee came to power, the political consensus had already shifted in favor of liberalization, and he was acting within this new consensus. Moreover, there is a difference between Upadhyay and Modi's electoral audience. As a BJP leader who requested anonymity said, there is no doubt that what Deendayal Upadhyay was proposing was a sui generis model of economics. But at the time, the Jansangh was also a party of small urban businessmen and capitalists. So his support for a decentralized private sector without monopolies also made political sense, even as it was firmly grounded in ethical economics, he said. Also, he added that by the time Modi came to power in 2014, the debate between socialism and capitalism, USA and USSR, etc., were all a thing of the past. India had already been liberalized for over 2 decades, and he said, don't forget, Modi was catering to the aspirations of this new post-liberalization India, but he was also effectively representing it. An actual match between Deendayal Upadhyay and Modi's economics beyond the rhetoric is therefore not possible, he said. Bala Subramanian agrees. It is the Swadeshi Jagran Manch and the Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh, both founded by RSS Pracharak Dattopant Thengri, who drew his economic philosophy from Upadhyay, that follow Upadhyay's economic philosophy way more than the BJP, he said. In a way, the tensions one sees between the Swadeshi Jagran Manch and the government, for instance, are the tension between Upadhyay and Modi's economics. You can read a full version of this article on theprint.in. Thank you so much for watching.